topic which, of course, has a huge relevance to India, as you know, and so all the more reason why you should participate in the Q&A that will follow. My aim is to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and then to let you ask me questions. So, by way of introduction, what I would say is that free speech is something that is valued in all democratic societies. And the importance of free speech is underlined not only by law, but also by what happens in society in general. And I would say that in a truly free society, freedom of expression should be the norm, and any restrictions on freedom of expression should be the exception. Now, free speech values have been recognized even before their inclusion in law, that is, in international human rights instruments. But a very important question that arises is free speech absolute? And the answer to that question has to be a definite no. We all value free speech, but free speech cannot be absolute. There will have to be restrictions put sometimes on free speech. And clearly, the dispute is about the extent to which restrictions can be put. And I'll talk about that in the course of my lecture. There are no rights in this world which are absolute. Even the right to life is not absolute. If you want me to talk more about that, do ask me in the Q&A and I'll explain. So free speech is definitely not absolute. But I believe that we should adopt a maximalist position on free speech. In other words, we don't want to adopt an absolutist position, but we do want there to be maximum rein given for free speech. In my view, the only limitation that should be put on free speech is when speech tends to incite violence. So violence should be the dividing line. And I would say that by and large, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution has got this reasonably right. Unfortunately, in India, you have Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, which also, although it gives a lot of freedom, imposes too many restrictions. And if you have any interest in that, I'm quite happy to discuss that issue later on. Now, a question that sometimes arises is freedom of expression a preferred freedom in the hierarchy of rights? And the answer has to be no. It is just as important as other freedoms, although I noticed that the Supreme Court of India has frequently referred to freedom of expression as being paramount in some circumstances. But don't forget that freedom of expression has the potential to clash with other freedoms and with other interests. So, for example, you must have heard of hate speech. Now, you cannot say that my freedom of expression will be used to spread hate. That is not acceptable in a decent society. All I would say in that regard at the moment is that you need to consider the importance of ethics as much as law. Law is important, but ethics is equally important. So sometimes self-restraint is called for through ethics. Now, there are a number of key issues in relation to freedom of expression. So you could, for example, think about free speech being subjected to varying levels of protection. In other words, to different levels of protection. So some kind of speech would be completely disallowed. And those are essentially what I referred to earlier as speech inciting people to violence. And there are certain other kinds of speech which are allowed subject to conditions or limitations. And of course, there's the other issue of the distinction between commercial speech and political speech. So, if you're talking about commercial speech, that is generally speaking given less protection than political speech. Now, one other very important issue in the discussion is whether freedom of expression should be allowed to be subjected to what is called prior restraint, in other words, censorship, or do you allow people to say what they want to say and penalize them afterwards if what they say is against the law? Generally speaking, countries like India take the latter view. But of course, you have to have other safeguards as well when it comes to regulating free speech. So, if you're talking about broadcasting, then there should be even handedness in the way that the government or the state hands out licenses for broadcasting. And there are also certain well recognized legal principles which should apply in the regulation of free speech, to which I will make reference just in a few minutes. And don't forget, what is extremely important in all this is that there should be an independent judiciary, because without an independent judiciary, it will be very difficult to resolve disputes that arise from time to time. Now, what is the position of free speech in international law? As you're aware, freedom of expression finds a place in many international human rights instruments. So, if you look at Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about everybody having the right to freedom of expression. Similarly, by complete coincidence, there is Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which elaborates on what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says in relation to freedom of expression. And then, of course, you have regional human rights instruments like the European Convention on Human Rights, which also refer to everybody's right to freedom of expression. And quite clearly, the regional instruments vary in the way they treat this freedom. So the European Convention on Human Rights takes an approach which I think is quite close to the approach taken by the Indian Constitution. So the European Convention says that it is possible for restrictions to be imposed on freedom of expression as long as those restrictions are necessary in a democratic society, as long as the restrictions are proportional. In other words, that there is a reasonable relationship um, between the objectives that are sought to be achieved by imposing restrictions and the means that are adopted to achieve those objectives. And finally, of course, the European Convention gives individual countries within the Council of Europe a degree of freedom, latitude, which is called margin of appreciation. But of course, all these international instruments are couched in very general terms. So you will not necessarily get a solution to any particular problem by looking at the international instruments. Now, I referred briefly to censorship. What is the legal position about censorship? Now, you may be slightly disappointed to hear that although censorship is contentious, controversial, it is nonetheless permitted by the law. In other words, there is no prohibition against censorship in the law. In India, for example, censorship is not constitutionally invalid, but there have been a number of instances where censorship by the government has been challenged and successfully challenged. So you can look up the case of Binod Rao versus M.R. Masani, which happened during the internal emergency in 1976. And there, the Supreme Court um, gave some very instructive guidance on what can be censored and what cannot. So the court said, for example, that simply because somebody is saying something critical of the government, it does not mean that they should be stopped from saying so. In other words, simply because dissent, disapproval, or criticism of the government is expressed in strong language is no reason to ban its publication. Now, generally speaking, censorship is the exception rather than the rule. In other words, if you want to write a book, you don't have to submit the book for examination by the government before it is published. But there is an exception, and that is motion pictures, films. If you want to show a film for public exhibition, you produce a film which you want to show to the public, then you will have to submit it to the Board of Certification, what used to be called the censor board. So censorship is routine in relation to motion pictures, but not in relation to other media. Now, what are the purposes of regulation? In other words, why do we need to have regulation? And I would say that there are a number of reasons why regulation is necessary. I'm talking here about regulation of free speech. First of all, there are many state-related interests which need to be protected. For example, national security. You cannot have a situation where somebody says, in exercise of their free speech rights, they will do things that threaten national security. For example, reveal the movement of troops. That, of course, will not be allowed. Likewise, there is a need to preserve public order and tranquility. So in society, you don't want riots, which are likely to threaten people's lives and property. So that is another ground on which regulation is allowed. You could also have regulation to prevent certain harms. For example, to protect children from undesirable content in the media. And that is, again, acceptable. You can have regulation to maintain certain standards of decency in society. So not just children, but even adults. There is an expectation that people will not be exposed to indecent material on any media. Now, obviously, this is very contentious because what may be indecent to one person may not be indecent to another. So this is not an easy issue to resolve, but there are ways of resolving them. So we will talk about this later on if you have any interest. Then, of course, you can have regulations to comply with a country's international obligations. So, for example, India may have entered into a treaty with another country under the terms of which certain things cannot be revealed to the public. Now, that confidentiality has to be respected. And so, therefore, there is that ground for regulation as well. And sometimes free speech is regulated to promote cultural norms, national language, etc. So you know that in India, there are essentially three languages. So you have the two main ones, which are Hindi and English, but you also have a regional language. So that is, you can have a law which says that to promote the national language or any other language or the cultural norms, freedom of expression can be regulated. Another reason for regulation is to avoid monopolies. So if a particular media group becomes too big, then a law can be passed to bring it down to size. And that is, again, entirely reasonable and permissible. In addition to that, you can have regulation to protect private rights, the private rights of individuals. So an example would be reputation, a person's reputation. So how is that going to be regulated? It will be regulated through the use of defamation laws. Now, of course, in India, there's a big controversy about whether it is reasonable to have criminal defamation. And again, this is a very contentious issue. I'm quite happy to talk about it if you want later on. It is possible also, in terms of private interest, to protect certain other legitimate interests like intellectual property. So you have the right, you have the law on copyright in India, which imposes restrictions on people's freedom of expression. You cannot say that because I have a right to free speech, I will copy somebody else's work. That is not allowed. So again, regulation is necessary. And of course, you can have regulation to promote technical efficacy or technical efficiency. So you can have standardization of practices and so on and so forth. So if you're talking about rationing airwaves or the broadcasting spectrum, then that also will fall under legitimate media regulation. So you can see that there are so many grounds under which the media can be regulated or people can be regulated in relation to the exercise of their right to freedom of expression. Now, what are the types of regulation? Essentially, there are two big types, and there is one which is a combination of the two. So you can have legal regulation, that is, regulation by statute, law passed by parliament. And this is usually called hard law regulation. And such regulation usually is accompanied by strong sanctions. So there will be punishment, either in terms of fines or the possibility of compensation, or in exceptional circumstances, even imprisonment. Um, and then, of course, there is voluntary regulation, which is purely self imposed. And this is what is called soft law. It's based on codes of conduct. And there are different types of voluntary regulations. So, for example, a group of newspaper publishers can come together and say that we are going to regulate ourselves. If there are any complaints against any of our newspapers, then we are willing to adjudicate those complaints. If they do that, then that system would be called self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is obviously much less strong than legal regulation, but it works in some countries where there is a willingness to exercise self-restraint. And then, of course, you have something called hybrid regulation, which is a combination of legal and self-regulation. Quite frankly, the concept of hybrid regulation is quite a nebulous one, and therefore I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I want to move on just to talk about a few important considerations, and to say that, first of all, there is a huge tension between freedom of expression and regulation, because obviously some kind of regulation will be considered unacceptable. And when that happens, the argument will be that it impinges on freedom of expression. Because remember, I told you at the beginning that freedom of expression should be the rule and restriction or regulation should be the exception. Now, when there is a clash between expression and regulation, then there are a number of legal, economic, ethical, cultural, and practical safeguards to try to resolve those kinds of disputes. And of course, there can be variable approaches to regulation between media sectors. So there can be more regulation of movies than of books or newspapers. And of course, there will be wide variations between countries in media regulation. Some countries are more liberal, some are less liberal. So an example is that when you're talking about standards of decency, then you'll notice that countries like those in Scandinavia are more liberal in allowing pornography or in allowing obscenity than, say, countries in Western Europe, particularly countries like the UK. And of course, you have to keep in mind the changing media environment and also cultural shifts in society. Nowadays, there's a third factor, which is advances in technology, all of which also dictate the pace, direction, and nature of media regulation. A very important consideration in regulating the media or regulating free speech is the concept of public interest. There are certain things which technically would be illegal, but they may be allowed because there's an overwhelming public interest in allowing free speech. An example is, that generally speaking, certain kinds of speech would be prohibited because they infringe other people's privacy. Now, what if somebody did a sting operation? Now, sting operation does involve the invasion of people's privacy, but a sting operation can be justified on the grounds of public interest. So public interest is very, very important. And again, if you have any interest in this topic, please ask me at the end of my talk, and I will explain this in greater detail. But I want to leave you with one thought about public interest, which is simply because something is interesting to the public does not make it a matter of public interest. Remember that phrase, okay? I don't have too much time to elaborate on that now, but I'm happy to talk about it later on when we have Q&A. Now, I told you earlier that there are certain safeguards that are available in relation to legal regulation. And I want to just touch on those safeguards. So you have a number of principles which are very relevant in this context. You have, first of all, the principle of legality, which means that any restriction that is imposed on free speech will have to be legal. Legal means it has to be sanctioned by the law, which means that there has to be a law supporting that restriction. Now, it's not enough to have a law because the law may be faulty, but at least you should have a law. Without the law, you cannot impose any restriction. There's also the principle of necessity. So even if you have a law, is the law really necessary? Is the restriction really necessary? Very, very important to understand. The principle of proportionality. Is the law such that it allows for restrictions to be imposed which are proportional to the mischief that is sought to be cured or to be avoided? Also, there's a principle of non-discrimination and principles of fairness. So you cannot have a restriction that applies to a certain group of people but does not apply to other groups of people, and the distinction between the two is irrational. So you cannot say that people belonging to X community will be restricted in speaking, whereas people belonging to Y community will not. Now, if there is no reasonable basis for distinguishing between X and Y, then clearly that would be unacceptable. And of course, there's the principle of transparency. So if you have restrictions imposed, then they should be made transparent. You can't have secret methods of regulating free speech. There's an expectation as well that the principle of consistency will be followed when it comes to imposing restrictions, or more generally, when it comes to regulating free speech. There's a further expectation that any regulation will be certain or stable. In other words, the law will have an element of stability or certainty. It doesn't keep constantly shifting. One other very important principle is you cannot apply a law retroactively or retrospectively. In other words, that you can't impose a restriction today and say that it began to apply yesterday. That again would be unfair and therefore illegal. And finally, you could talk about the principle of simplicity. In other words, any regulation that is sought to be brought in should ideally be simple for people to understand and people to make sense of what is being sought. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, there can be variations between sectors, between media sectors, when it comes to regulation. And generally speaking, there is less regulation in relation to the press, to the printed matter, and much more regulation in relation to broadcasting. And of course, nowadays, also we are told we should have greater regulation of the electronic media, of the of the social media. Now, it is not easy to devise schemes of regulation. So, when it comes, for example, to uh, electronic media, then you can think about regulation of the infrastructure, regulation of distribution of content, regulation of access by the audience, and of course, you can have content regulation. So it's quite a complex area. But of course, the complexity has been increased by the concept of convergence. As you know, now there's been a huge amount of media convergence, which makes the task of the regulator much more difficult than has been the case in the past. Um, I want to sort of begin to wind up my talk because I've spoken now for just under half an hour. And I want to look at what are the main threats to freedom of expression currently, contemporary threats. So, first of all, of course, you have threats from the government suppression of free speech. It is happening in many countries, and it will happen. It will continue to happen for as long as societies exist. Governments do have a habit of trying to control the media and trying to suppress any material that is published which they consider to be against their interests or embarrassing to them. So there is governmental suppression of free speech, and I am sure you'll ask me about particular examples concerning India. There are also attacks on free speech from criminals, in particular from terrorists. Do remember that terrorists can also impose censorship on free speech, which is just as bad as the government imposing restrictions. There can sometimes be attacks on free speech from media proprietors, the owners of newspapers, television companies. They may not want certain things to be revealed because it goes against their interests. That also has to be considered. Don't think that censorship only comes from the government. There can sometimes be attacks on free speech from religious and other bodies. You know that some religions are very intolerant of criticism. When that happens, that is quite bad. And of course, I would say that nowadays there is another big threat, and that is the threat from political correctness, what is called the cancel culture, the no platforming, etc. It's also sometimes referred to as the woke culture. I sincerely hope that none of you will succumb to that temptation. I know it is superficially attractive, but please think very carefully. If I had to give one big message in the course of my lecture today, it is simply this: do not be swayed into thinking that certain speech should be censored on grounds of political correctness. You know, you can take it too far. It is not good. And there's also the risk of self censorship, which comes from virtue signaling. And it's particularly effective against young people, young and shy people. You know, many of you are very young, and you can imagine the pressure that is being put on you sometimes to conform to certain norms. You cannot criticize certain communities. Is that a good thing? Generally speaking, maybe, but you should have the right to criticize. And there is unfortunately also now in countries like India a misuse of private law, for example, the law on defamation. And that also needs to be guarded against. And furthermore, there is emerging a new threat from the law of privacy. Now, the law of privacy seems quite innocuous, but actually, it is quite dangerous sometimes when it is applied to free speech because you're prevented from talking about certain people because they say you're invading their privacy. But what if they've done something wrong? Or what if they, um, if, for example, celebrities, if they behave in a manner that is likely to corrupt young people? Remember, many celebrities are role models and they deserve to behave well. Now, if they don't, should you not have the right to criticize them? The answer is yes. But they sometimes go to court and argue that their right to privacy has been invaded, which is rubbish. It should never be allowed to happen. So, talking about the cancel culture, the one thing I want to tell you is that there is a myth that the regulation of social media is substantively different from the regulation of other media. Believe me, that is not strictly correct. Because what is defamation on social media is exactly the same as defamation on traditional media. But there are differences between social media and traditional media. So, for example, in social media, you have the problem of anonymity, which doesn't exist, at least not to the same extent in traditional media. There's also the problem of cross-border nature of social media, because most social media carried on through the internet, and therefore you can have material circulating across borders, across national boundaries. And then, of course, in the case of social media, um, there is the problem of instant or immediate publication, which can sometimes be quite tricky. Um, and don't forget that social media generally have huge audiences compared to traditional media. But social media also have advantages. So, for example, it is easy to make corrections or retractions on social media than it is in traditional media. And also, social media has the advantage of interactivity, of two-way communication, which traditional media does not have. So, the long and short of it is that social media are capable of enhancing freedom, but they're also capable of causing huge harms. So, it's a question of where do you draw the balance. And again, I'm happy to discuss this if you have any questions. Now, what about fake news? I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. I want to first of all tell you that generally speaking, the concept of fake news is a mythical concept. Now, I know you'll be surprised when you hear me say this, but believe me, it is a bit of a red herring, and it is usually ideologically motivated. It's ideologically motivated from both sides of the ideological spectrum, both from the right and from the left. So let me give you an example or one or two examples which will make you understand what I'm trying to say. There is no doubt that people say things which are untrue, and that is sometimes called fake news. So if I said to you, the sun rises in the west, now that is clearly false, demonstrably false, and therefore you can call it fake news. But should I be punished for saying that? My answer is no. What you can do is you can ridicule me, you can condemn me, but I should not be punished. You know, there was a man in London, in Oxford Street, who used to walk up and down the street carrying a sandwich board which said, "The end of the world is nigh." He did it for many years. Now, of course, what he was saying was wrong, was false, and therefore fake news. But should you punish him? Should you not allow him to do what he was doing? He was just providing some amusement. And look at it like that. So, fake news is not a reason for censoring free speech. But if, as a result of fake news or false news, harm is caused, then of course you can punish the person making that statement or those statements. So, an example is, you know that it is considered illegal for a person to shout fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. Why? Because it will lead to panic, it will lead to injury to a lot of people. Now, that, of course, is covered by the normal laws. You don't have to have a special law on fake news to cover that situation. And of course, that is because it is not acceptable in civilized society for such statements to be made. And there are laws which allow for such situations to be dealt with. Laws which talk about statements which cause false public alarm or statements which conduce to public mischief, etc. And don't forget, in the Indian Penal Code, there is a section 505 within brackets 1, which deals with this issue. So even existing law is there to cover those kinds of situations. But as I said, otherwise you should simply ignore such statements or treat them with contempt or treat them with ridicule as part of the price that democracy demands in a free society. Now, if you're oversensitive to such speech, then it can have huge destructive effects. So please, please, please do not be misled into thinking that you need a law against fake news. You don't, because existing law is more than sufficient. Likewise, I want to come to another important issue, and it is uh, should causing offense through speech be made punishable? My answer is no, because in a free society, people should learn to take the rough with the smooth. And also, what one person considers offensive may not be considered offensive by another person. So it's very subjective. So you should allow everybody the right to be offensive. Sometimes you need to be offensive to give a jolt to society into reforming undesirable practices. So, for example, female genital mutilation. I'm sure most of you would be against it. And you can only bring about reform if you shock people in the community that believes in FGM. Okay? Likewise, stoning for adultery. Now, that again requires a jolt to be given to the religion which sanctions such practices. Or you know that until recently, women were not allowed to drive cars in Saudi Arabia. Now, what is wrong in being offensive about that practice? According to me, no, there's nothing wrong. You have to be offensive, only then there will be reform in that society. So I would say, please don't be misled into thinking that causing offense should be made punishable. But I want to come to another side of the coin, and that is, should people cause offense to others simply because the law allows you to cause offense? And my answer again is no. And that is where self-restraint comes in. So, if you have the right to cause offense to someone, you should ideally not use that right. But you don't use that right as a matter of self-discipline, not because the law compels you not to use it. I hope you understand the distinction. It's very, very important. So you only use the right to cause offense in certain unavoidable circumstances. But otherwise, please don't cause offense to other people. Be civilized, be nice to other people. But where it is necessary, you should have the right to cause offense. Of course, to some extent, causing offense and similar actions can be controlled by soft law. So you can have a code of conduct which says how people should behave towards each other, but that will not be law. That will not be hard law. All that it will do is name and shame. Very, very important. In many societies, naming and shaming is more powerful than punishing through hard law. Now, I want to very briefly talk about business regulation and then I'll wind up. So, business regulation is extremely important because big business can have the potential to cause harm to a lot of people through free speech. And you see this already happening with big tech companies. Very, very important in the current context. And the real problem with the big tech companies is that they are very selective in dealing with content carried on their platforms. So they're very quick to ban Trump, but they are not at all quick to ban other extremists. For example, Islamic extremists who say all kinds of things which are more dangerous than anything that Trump has said. Now, I'm not trying to argue the case for Trump. I'm simply telling you that if you're going to be principled, then you also have to be even-handed, which big tech companies are not at the moment. Then there's a very important question of what are these tech platforms or the social media platforms really? Are they publishers or are they mere carriers? So if they are publishers, then clearly they will have to conform to certain rules, which means that they will lose the protection that they currently enjoy from being sued for defamation and contempt and various other things. For example, you must have heard of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the US that protects tech companies. But then, if they say we are going to ban X, Y, or Z because we don't agree with with the content of what they say, then they are not mere carriers. They begin to exercise the role of publishers. And if they do exercise the role of publishers, then they will have to take the consequences of such behavior. And of course, don't forget that there's also room for anti-monopoly laws so that no big tech company becomes too large to threaten freedom of expression. Now, finally, I just want to talk a little bit about trends and prospects. So clearly, there is going to be the impact of technology, and that is going to determine media regulation, free speech regulation in the years to come. There will also be the impact of shifts in political and economic ideologies. We saw this happen to some extent in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. But who knows what else can happen in the coming decades? There will be pressures on public broadcasting, subsidies will be reduced, and that will also have an effect on free speech. Um, then there is the possibility of dumbing down of content, which is another factor to be looked at. There's growing internationalization and homogenization of content. So what is happening now is, for example, in India, you get a lot of American soap operas, which of course are also distributed in other countries around the world. So there's a greater degree of homogenization of content, the McDonaldization of the media, and which means that there can be a dilution of national cultural pressures as a result of the easy availability of foreign content. But the one thing about which I think we can be reasonably sure is that the need for regulation will never come to an end. So regulation is here to stay. How you do it and how you do it smartly is really the challenge for most societies. I'll stop there. I want to thank you for your patience in listening to me, and I'm ready to take questions.
So it is my humble request to all the participants, if they have any questions, so they can ask. Sir, actually, we have two questions in our chat box as well. So
Okay.
can I read for you?
Yep.
Yeah. So there is one question from Ms. Shivika Sharma. She's saying, is there no need for laws against fake news even on social media? If yes, then which laws cover that?
Okay. I will try to answer this in very simple terms. First of all, when you talk about fake news, if what you say is, for example, defamation of somebody, then there are laws against defamation in India. In India, there are too many laws against defamation. There is civil law, there's criminal law. But if you're talking about fake news concerning the judiciary, then there is the law of contempt. Likewise, there are so many laws, and don't forget the Indian Penal Code also has laws against hate speech. So if you're talking about fake news in the form of hate speech, there are laws to control that. But what you don't want to have is some ridiculously widely worded law which can be misused. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that a lot of laws in India are being misused, and that is not to be allowed. Okay? I can see another question there which says, could you talk a bit more on cancel culture and political correctness? Now it has disappeared, so maybe I'll have to go back to it. Just wait. Uh, yeah, more on cancel culture and political correctness and their impact on free speech, on society, positive and negative aspects. I cannot see any positive aspects to cancel culture. Look, if you say something against me, what should be the correct response? What should be my correct response? I should try to debate with you. Suppose you say that for the last 40 minutes I've been talking rubbish. Okay? I should recognize your right to say that. I should not say you should be prevented from saying that. That is cancel culture. Cancel culture means don't allow somebody to say something that you don't like. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I believe that there should be freedom of speech and debate. So if you want to say that what I've said is rubbish, I would welcome the opportunity and I would defend your right to say it. Now, what is the answer to what you've said? Suppose what you said is false, is wrong. Then I will defend myself. I should have the right to reply. And you then will have the right to respond to my reply. And I will then reply to your response to my reply. And like that, we can have a decent, healthy debate. That is what we need, not to say, stop somebody from criticizing me. That is what cancel culture is all about. So I cannot see any good, anything positive about cancel culture. It is completely negative. But do remember, I've told you one other very important thing. Simply because you have a right to criticize does not mean you have to use that right. You have to be quite selective in the way that you engage in debate. Okay? All right. Can I go down that list? I can now see a few questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. In the present scenario, sometime law of sedition is used to suppress free speech. Correct. Now, the law of sedition has unfortunately been very badly misused and abused in India. First of all, the law of sedition was meant to have a certain purpose. But today, any criticism of government seems to attract a charge of sedition, which is rubbish. But the good news is, Indian judiciary sometimes sees through uh, this practice on the part of governments and tries to um, effectively protect people from being punished wrongly under the law of sedition. The law of sedition is one which requires a lot of attention. And quite frankly, I think in the Indian context, the law of sedition needs to be reformed through a change in the law. But even as it stands, it is possible for the law of sedition to be used more sensibly than it has been so far. Okay? The next question is there any limit for free speech for media trial? Now, it's a slightly odd question. What you're asking is probably whether media can talk about uh, an existing criminal case, an ongoing criminal case. And the answer is yes, but they have to be careful. Now, this falls within the law of contempt. So what is needed is for media to be very careful when discussing the merits of a pending trial or an ongoing trial. So you can say things like, these were the facts of the case and this was the evidence for and against the accused. But you cannot say before the trial is over that the accused is definitely guilty or the accused is definitely not guilty. That would be prejudging the outcome of the trial. That should be avoided. Unfortunately, of course, in India, people don't understand this. And so, for example, some of you may remember what happened in the Arushi murder case. There was such a lot of abuse of uh, media freedom by the media, and it did amount to a lot of pressure being put on the judiciary, on the parents, etc. So again, it is a case of balance, and quite frankly, one of the reasons why this happens in India is that journalists are not well informed about the law, and that's why I always say that journalists in India need a lot of training sessions, and I hope that the Anand College will at some point think about organizing media law training sessions. Believe me, there is a lot of demand for it. You can even charge media companies money for attending this. You can make it a commercial venture, and the advantages are enormous. I do a lot of these media training courses around the world, not only in India, but I can see how much of ignorance there is at the moment among journalists. Sometimes ignorance is genuine, and so they're very happy. They're very grateful to be informed. So I can give you an example. About 3 4 years ago, I did a 10-day media law training course in the NUJS, the National University of Juridical Sciences in Calcutta. Now, it was very well attended because it was not only for the university people, but also from the press club of Calcutta. So maybe you should think about some innovative ways, and also such programs will have the effect of raising your profile. So people will start talking about Anand College becoming a great center for media law training. And it's not only media law training, it's also media ethics training. That is equally important. Of course, they will have to be dealt with separately, but it is possible to do it. Okay. All right. Next question. If social backlash of celebrities on social media platforms leads to dire consequences, like the suicide of celebrities, can the people who do backlash can be held accountable? Again, the question is unfortunately very vaguely worded, but anyway, I assume that you have in mind Sushant Singh Rajput, and my answer, quite frankly, is that of course some kinds of media criticism should not be allowed, but the existing law does provide for punishing such acts. So you cannot say that we need a new law. And really, it all depends on what is being said and how a reasonable person will react to what is being said. So if somebody is very sensitive, doesn't like criticism and commits suicide, then the person who criticized cannot be held liable, because ultimately there has to be a degree of reasonableness in how you deal with these situations. Okay, the next question is, there are many inappropriate contents on social media. YouTube. Sorry. YouTube that uses abusive languages in their video. How can law control these big social media platforms from restricting such videos or posts to be uploaded or viewed publicly? Now, it's not easy, but as I said, to some extent, you have to allow for freedom of expression, which includes freedom to criticize other people. But if the criticism becomes uh, violative of the law, then of course you will have every right, if you're the victim, to sue the person and to, in some cases, not always, to sue the social media platform as well if they've not taken reasonable precautions. But I would be against censorship completely. And one of the big problems in India, of course, is that you have a dysfunctional judiciary. That is, according to me, the single biggest problem. So in India, if you file a case, the case will go on for 30 years. Now, if that is the case, people will lose respect for the law. So don't blame freedom of expression for other ills that exist in Indian society. Okay, the state uses sedition law for curtailment of freedom of expression. How this law can be checked? I've already answered that question. Okay, somebody was thanked me for the response. I want to thank you for that. Right, somebody is paying me a compliment. It was wonderful listening to you. Would it be possible for you to talk about attempted media censorship and violation of citizens' right to free speech during the second wave, when the citizenry, in fact, seeking help through media and social platforms? Well, this is again something which reinforces my message, namely, it doesn't matter whether it's COVID time or other times, you have to have maximum freedom of expression, because only then people will get correct information. Sometimes people will give wrong information. Doesn't matter. Even if there is some wrong information given out, at least if you have a debate, there's a possibility of other people correcting the wrong information, and therefore you'll have a clearer picture. So I would be against any kind of censorship, even on the grounds of COVID. Okay, one more question, Gauri Dutt. In a country of India, religious sentiments matter most, unlike Western societies. So I want to know your views on the conflict between blasphemy and the right to freedom of speech and expression. Well, blasphemy is a concept which has been unfortunately abused in many countries, not just India. And you need to be very careful when you're talking about blasphemy. Really, what it is anything that is likely to cause violence that needs to be suppressed. Simply because you criticize a religion, that should be no reason for you to be punished. People should have the freedom to criticize all religions. Of course, you don't have to criticize. You have to be careful. That is where your self-discipline comes in. But if, for example, you notice that in a certain religion there are some horrible practices, for example, women being badly treated in any religion, why should you not criticize that religion? Why should you not criticize the leaders of that religion? Of course you should. So I would say to use blasphemy law in those circumstances will be completely unacceptable. But the safeguard there, again, is the judiciary. Very, very important to remember the importance of a judiciary. If you had independent, courageous, um, competent judges, then half your battle is won, even if you don't have very good laws. Okay. Um, okay. I read an article recently in the Times of India which talked about the right to be forgotten, in which a celebrity's 7-year past act was still shown at top of Google search when it was Googled. Can the law be made to delete the history videos of such incident, as it will each and every time humiliate the person's image for the entire life and afterwards? I'm totally against such a law. You know why? Because you cannot erase history. What you can do is you can put up material which shows that the person has changed. No problem at all. So if you say that somebody who was um, convicted and punished for rape has reformed and he is now a very good, upstanding citizen, that's fine. You can put out that material as much as what happened earlier exists. Let people decide. So if you see that somebody has genuinely reformed, your respect for that person will increase. The solution to this problem is not to censor something that has actually happened. So you cannot erase history. History is very important for people to have in all societies. All right, I think I've come to the end of all those questions. Now, is there anybody who is bold enough to actually speak and ask a question? Don't be afraid. Don't be shy.
Dr. Saab, Adab, this is Imran from Hyderabad.
Very happy to hear from you. Go ahead.
Dr. Saab, this is a very specific question. During the first phase of the lockdown, my
Yeah.
father, who happens to be a medical doctor, he lodged a couple of complaints against people who had come from Nizamuddin to Hyderabad and contributed to the spread of COVID-19. And these were basically the initial stages. So the efficacy of this disease was not known. The virulence of this disease was not known. So what happened was the police was not very helpful, Dr. Saab. In fact, they tried to sabotage the efforts that were being taken up by my father by threatening with IPC sections like 354, which are which basically constitute harassment of women. Because some of the people who were spreading the disease were in fact women. It included men, children, and women. So, in this context, what do you think would be would be a good choice on my part to do right now? Should I go ahead with the complaints, or should I just take a step backwards?
Okay. Good question. Now, I'm assuming, if I understood you correctly, that the allegations were made against your father. Is that right?
My father and against me.
Okay. All right. So you're both the victims of what is basically a defamatory campaign. Am I right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So for the time being, leave aside what you said earlier about harassment of women. Okay, I'll come to that. But really, what the crux of the matter is this: you and your father appear to have a good case for your reputation to be spoiled. Now, the way you deal with it is, now I'm going to give you a theoretical answer and I'm going to give you a practical answer. So the theoretical answer is that you file a suit for defamation and or a criminal complaint of defamation, because in India it's possible to deal with defamation under both civil law and criminal law. Now, I am sorry to say that your civil suit will take many years before it is heard. It depends on where you live and what the situation there is, but generally speaking, I would say 20 years is common. Okay, by which time both of you would have grown much older. The criminal complaint, on the other hand, has a slightly shorter life. So it may come up, it may finish in 7 years, 8 years, 10 years. Now, when I say short, in most countries, people will be shocked when you say 7 years is short. But anyway, so that's where we are. Now, don't forget also that there is a lot of scope for corruption in the system, which means that your complaint and your suit can be derailed at any point. And so there are massive risks in dealing with this problem through the law. On the other hand, one practical way of dealing with this, as many of the people who have told me from India did, was to simply ignore and the whole thing will go away. But I can see the hurt that is caused to people like you and your father. So one way would be for you actually, luckily, as I understand it, either you or your father or both are journalists, so you're capable of writing. So why don't you write an article simply exposing the lies that have been told?
Thank you so much, Dr. Saab. That's very helpful of you. And basically, I'm a law student, and my father is a medical practitioner. He's a pediatrician, and in fact, he's done his master's from the UK, the Royal
Okay.
College.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now,
So, apart from yes, yes, Dr. Saab.
I probably made an error in assuming that either of you is a journalist. But you know what? I can modify my answer and say, try to get on your side some conscientious and powerful journalists who can present your side of the story.
Yes, Dr. Saab. Yes. Yes, that's been done. And apart from that, I'll quickly finish in about 30 seconds. That's been done. And a letter was shot off to the SHO, the commissioner, and the DCP regarding our rights. And the fact that we'd be filing a suit under Article 226 of the Constitution of India with the High Court if he doesn't stop making such vague allegations. So he's more or less been put in place. Now, the question was basically about my next step regarding the case, and I think you've answered me to complete satisfaction, Dr. Saab. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anybody else? Now that the ice has been broken, I'm sure there's somebody who wants to also ask a question.
It is my request to other participants, if they have any questions, they can ask.
Yeah, don't feel shy. I keep repeating because ultimately interaction is what benefits all of us. I'm assuming that most of your students are not Gujarati.
Yes, sir. There are students from all over India.
Right, because I can't see too many Gujarati names there.
Yes.
I was about to say, if you want to ask me in Gujarati, I have no problem. By all means, go ahead. You know, you'll be surprised to hear that in spite of my name, I have no connection with South India.
Okay. So if
So please,
anybody wants to ask any question in Gujarati as well, so they can ask. There's
but
no
please don't ask me any question in Tamil or Malayalam or Kannada or anything like that. I won't be able to understand. Hindi is okay as well, by the way. Hindi, Urdu, no problem. No, I think you've all had your fill, or at least you seem to be all very content. So if that is the case, then I will ask you to just wind up.
Yes, sir. So actually, this is
One
one.
question which has just
Yes,
come.
yes,
In
sir.
today's time, media is paid. How this expression is safe now? I don't quite understand the question, but I gather it has something to do with paid media. Okay, there is a problem. There's a huge problem of paid media in India now. Actually, that is more a problem not of media law but of media ethics. So it is something that normally I devote a lot of time to discussing when I do my training sessions on media law, media ethics. And really, what it is it requires more education than punishment. And ultimately, it's also a question of conscience, because why do people do such things? Why do journalists or media proprietors accept money and distort the publication of either news or information? Um, it is very difficult to deal with this problem through the law. Not impossible, but quite difficult. There are existing laws which prevent people from abusing their position. So, for example, if you're talking about financial journalism and there is paid news, then nowadays you have the law under the SEBI rules against insider trading, conflict of interest, etc., which can be used. But generally speaking, it is quite difficult to deal with this problem except through media ethics. Okay. Oh, paid media does not care about rights. They just show which is good for their TRP. So how are rights secure in such? Okay, my answer to that in general terms is pluralism. You know what? If you have a channel which is now what did you say? This, let me just go back to the previous question. Um, okay, if there's a channel which only wants to increase its TRP and therefore produces rubbish content, but content that is sort of popular among certain sections of the public, my answer to that would be, why don't other decent people come together and produce a rival channel which has good, wholesome material, and see who wins. Now, I know that cheap, sensationalist programs have an audience. I don't deny that. But believe me, in the long run, the solution is pluralism. You have more and more channels. People will make up their mind which is a good channel and which is not. So, to give you an example, without naming names, you know that it's very common in India for there to be a few channels where there's nothing but a shouting match. Whenever there's any debate, people just keep shouting over each other. They just don't make any sense to the listener or the viewer. Now, why do you need that? Why can't people have intelligent debate? And there are a few other channels on Indian TV, nowadays more on the web than on TV, where there is genuine debate. People don't interrupt each other. You know, you talk nicely. Even if you have a strong debate, as long as it is done in a civilized way. This is important. And ultimately, people will get the message. So this requires a long-term solution. Okay, there's one more question which came in. What are the threats to freedom of speech, and is there any limitation of freedom of speech, freedom of expression? I'm afraid I have answered that question very elaborately in the course of my lecture, so I don't think at this stage I want to go into that all over again. Um, is trial by media essential or unethical? Oh, that's also a question I just answered a few minutes ago. What are your views on cyberbullying, like hate comments, that is freedom, like hate comments, is that freedom of speech? No, it's not freedom of speech. The good news is that there are laws in India which do provide for punishment of certain types of bullying. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't seem to understand the correct balance that needs to be struck in these situations. Simply because you find something offensive does not mean it is bullying, because you have to, in a democracy, take criticism. You don't like criticism, don't say the other person is bullying me. No, sometimes they may not be bullying you, they are simply criticizing you for something. So, for example, if there is a religious leader who is criticized by a Twitter storm, everybody saying some very harsh things about the religious leader, he can't say he's being bullied. Not at all. He has to face the facts. If he's confident, then he should actually he should be able to put up a defense of his position and prove that the people who are criticizing him are wrong. So cyberbullying is not such a simple thing as is made out from time to time. Okay, rather than pluralism, is there any way to stop such shows or programs, sir? Yes, there is. If they break the law, the program can be stopped. If they don't break the law, it cannot be stopped. Of course, there's a further problem in India, and that is you don't have a legal remedy that can be used quickly and effectively. Why? Because the court system is broken down. Now, there's no answer to that. That has nothing to do with media law. It has more to do with general society and the way things are organized within India. So, if you don't have a functioning judiciary, then you can kiss goodbye to almost all the rights that you have. Should political speech be more vigorously protected than other forms of expression? Generally speaking, yes, and that is what the law does. So, for example, compared to the rights of businessmen who are fighting over commercial matters, there will be a greater emphasis given to discussions of politics of other matters, not things which are only going to produce selfish gain. Okay, we seem to have. Oh, how is a student's freedom of speech restricted on social media sites such as Facebook? According to me, it's not restricted, and Facebook definitely does not deal with speech on the basis of whether the person making the speech is a student or a non-student. No, 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 not at all. So I don't know what the context of your question is, but if you want to elaborate, by all means do so. But the short answer to your question is that a student's freedom of speech is not restricted on social media any more than the speech of a non-student. Okay, does there is any really need to struck down? Because when I studied this section, I didn't find any issue to declare this section unconstitutional. Section 66A of the IT Act. Of course, there's every reason for it to be struck down, and it has been struck down by the Supreme Court because it was too vague and too destructive of free speech. Go and read the judgment of Justice Rohinton Nariman, and you'll get the full details. Kindly share your views on freedom of speech and expression of prisoners. Well, of course, prisoners also have freedom of speech and expression. You know that there are many prisoners who have written articles and books while in jail. And I can give you an example which is very recent. There is a man called Kobat Gandhi. I don't know if you've heard of him. Kobat Gandhi was in jail for about 10 years. Ultimately, all the cases against him were thrown out, and he's now a free man. He's not actually a free man. He's out of jail, but some of the cases are still running. But he wrote a book very recently, and that book has been making the rounds. So prisoners do have freedom of expression, but of course, prisoners have limited freedom of expression while they are in jail. Okay, I think the questions have dried up.
Yes, sir. Even I think that there are no more questions.
Mhm.
Okay. So with that, I think we should just come to the end of the session. So, sir, thank you so much. Okay, I would like to present my vote of thanks to Dr. Venkat Iyer, sir, for such an informative and interactive session and explaining us about the various facets of freedom of speech and expression, as well as various regulations at various stages. Sir, I'm sure that the information given by you will be beneficial to all our participants. And once again, sir, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming for this webinar. And with that, sir, we would like to present a virtual certificate to you. It's a gratitude certificate from our institute. And I would also like to thank Dr. Rekha Kumari Singh ma'am for her constant encouragement to all of us, as well as to Mr. Gururaj Devarhubli sir for coordinating this event and organizing this event. And with that, once again, thank you so much, sir. And now I would like to request all the dignitaries to kindly leave this session.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to all of you, and I wish Anand School every success. And as I said earlier, it'll be good if we are all able to meet in person at some point. I have not come to India now for 1.5 years, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to come there after October. So let us see how things are.
Yes.
And I look forward to visiting your school at some point. Okay?
Sure, sure, sure. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So we wind up?
Yes, sir. We can wind up.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye, bye, bye. Now it is my kind request to all the participants that you all can leave the session. Thank you so much for your patience hearing.